Okay, so very good morning to you, Dr. Schaffner, and thanks for joining me for this fireside chat, or rather a conversation. I would like to tell our viewers that this conversation will cover the energy ecosystem in India and Switzerland from a technical expert's perspective. So before we begin and go ahead with the main set of questions, Dr. Schaffner, please go ahead and introduce yourself and your research along with your area of expertise.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to say a few words about myself. My name is Schaffner. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Science Center at ETH Zurich, so the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Switzerland. The Energy Science Center is a competence center for energy research and education. So we bring together around 60 professors from 9 different departments at our school to tackle the challenges and issues in the future sustainable energy supply. And we do this in an interdisciplinary way. So we really have people from all different kinds of backgrounds working together. As I said, we're also active in education. So we have a master program there, and we do outreach events, etc. Before my time at ETH Zurich, I was working for the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, so our energy department in Switzerland, for several years.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Dr. Schaffner. Now moving on to our main questions, I would like to ask you that if you could speak to someone about the future of energy academic research, what would you like to ask?
Well, as researchers, of course, we also would always would like to know, okay, what will the future bring on one side? But then on the other hand, we also would like to shape the future. So we would like to understand, where do we have the challenges? Where do we see challenges today, and work on these? But then, of course, we also would like to dive deeper in basic research, and would like to understand, okay, where are there technologies, algorithms, know-how that still needs to be developed, that is not here yet today, that will maybe in the future help us solve our challenges or solve our problems. And just to give you 2 examples, on one side, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that will need flexibility in our electricity systems, and this flexibility can come from batteries, can come from demand side management. So there is a lot of research going on there, where we already know now that this will be, or is something that we have to tackle, on how to deal with these systemic aspects, how to deal with these technologies. On the other hand, there are also areas where we don't have a solution yet, where it's really more going into the basic research. And one such example is negative emission technologies. If we look at the scenarios today with net zero scenarios, where Switzerland are committed to by 2050, and I think the whole world at one point needs to move to, we see that we will not be able to reduce all emissions that we have today. So to compensate for these remaining emissions, and some of them will come from the energy sector, we need negative emissions. And there are technologies out there that do work, but there is a lot of things still needed to be done. So to put it, to come back to your questions again, I think it's really, we need both. We need the basic research, and we also need applied research. And of course, it always would be interesting to see, okay, where will we be going? But on the other hand, we also will shape the path where we are going.
Thanks for that answer, Dr. Schaffner. Now talking about new technologies, algorithms, and futures, tell us more about your activities at the ETH Science Center of the Energy Science Center of ETH Zurich, and what are the potential opportunities for collaboration, especially with your Indian peers and stakeholders?
Right. Yes, of course. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we are working in mainly in the interdisciplinary area. So our members, of course, they do basic research, but as the Energy Science Center, we try to bring all these things together and then look at it from a systemic point of view to better understand developments. And of course, there are certain issues which are very Swiss specific. For example, we have a huge share of hydropower, pumped hydropower in the Alps in Switzerland that are very important for the electricity supply in Switzerland. So we better need to understand how to involve this. But then there are other things that are, and of course, hydropower is also big in India, especially in certain areas where mountainous areas. But there are other questions where I think we are working on heavily, and I think that it's equally important in India as in Switzerland to really go into the details there. And just to pick out one example, the move or the electrification of the mobility sector. That's a big trend, and you're mentioning this as well, of course. And so we are more or less convinced that we need to go down this route. How exactly will be done, there are still certain questions open. For example, I think for individual cars, it's kind of like obvious nowadays that we probably will move to battery electric vehicles. For more heavy transport, cargo, it's not yet 100% clear. I mean, there are also ideas of using hydrogen there, or having other solution with synthetic fuels. I think there is still a lot to be discussed. But what is clear in any case is that the system will change dramatically, and we need to make our electricity system fit for this large share of electric mobility. And there are really many aspects there. There are aspects of smartness, if you want to call it like this, smart grids. How do you really make these charging stations smart and both helpful for the car owner that wants to charge his car whenever she or he wants, but also then to the system operators, that we don't have a huge peak of demand at 5 o'clock in the evening when everybody plugs in their car. So there are many issues there, down to even then control questions, and to also sector coupling. For example, if you look at buildings, and of course in India, it's in large parts, it's all about air conditioning, cooling, where in Switzerland it's maybe more about heating, but this is also changing in Switzerland now. We will see more and more cooling. And if you look at this, you can, of course, if you have a well-insulated house, you can, for example, switch off either the heating or the cooling system for a couple of hours while you charge your car. So that's really how these sectors of building and mobility sector come together. And this sounds maybe obvious, but if you want to really implement something like this, it's not trivial. And there are many control aspects, and many also systemic aspects that need to be solved. Not even talking about then regulatory or financial side as well. So I think there is a lot that can be done, and I think where we also, and this is just an example, where India and Switzerland could really work together and see how we can do that together.
Thanks for that, Professor. And as I can see, currently there is still a certain level of ambiguity when it comes to technology and policy. But India has set for itself ambitious goals to achieve 450 gigawatts of energy generation from renewables. What is the biggest risk that you think can derail the entire national level energy strategy?
That's not a simple question, because I think nobody can really foresee the future. And I mean, first, let me say that I do indeed agree with you that it's a very ambitious goal, but I also think it's very important to have these goals, because at the end, what we need is having a clear path where we are moving forward, and having also for the whole industry clearly a goal that we want to achieve. Of course, like to achieve these goals, there, as you mentioned, there are many risks, and I mean, there are technical problems, and we were discussing these before. But there we have brilliant engineers, both in India and in Switzerland, that have to work hard, but I'm sure they will be able to solve it, because we solved crazy problems before. So I think there needs to be work, and there needs to be time to implement these things, and that has not to be taken on a lightly. So it's a big challenge. But then on the other hand, what you of course also need at the end is investments. Somebody has to build it, so you need workers, people that actually do it, but somebody has to actually invest in these systems. And I think this is probably one of the really challenging points. How do you create policy framework that allows for these investments? I mean, either you do it with subsidies alone, but in looking at this huge growth that we're seeing, I'm not sure if India wants to just use subsidies. I mean, that is a possibility, but I guess that probably won't be the only thing. So what you then need is really a framework that attracts the investors and allows them to go there. And I mean, with the tremendous developments we have seen in photovoltaics, in PV, there is a lot of interest, and there is, of course, also in a world with low interest rates, there is a huge interest in investing in areas with a longer term profit margin, or like a positive rate of return. But what you need, of course, is then a framework that gives this stability. And so I think, if you ask me about risks, I think having a policy framework that does not allow for this stability, that could be a big risk. And we have seen this in other countries. When we looked at how it developed in Spain, there were these like change times where the policy framework was changing, and that of course is scaring investors, especially when they want to look further down. So yes, I mean, this is really more on a policy economic investment point of view. If we go to the technical challenges, I think I mentioned a few before, but one big thing is really that the system is fundamentally changing. So we're moving from an electric system that was designed top down, and that's true for India as well as Switzerland, where you have huge, big units producing electricity, and then you have a transportation grid, and then you have a distribution grid, and then you have the final customer at the end. So in 10, 20 years, that will be completely different, right? You will have producers in buildings, PV. You will have active consumers, for example, mobility charging, and they have to work together. And there is not thousands of units, or hundreds, or in Switzerland 100, and in India maybe thousands, but there will be millions of producers of electricity. And how do you bring them together? And that's really then also a question of a security of supply. How do you make sure that such a system that is very diverse, very distributed, how do you make it work in a way that it's still secure? And it is possible, but it's a change. And I mean, there are new threats coming in, like cybersecurity. We're talking about that quite often. We heard about the issues in the US, but in other countries as well. So this is then an additional risk, right? How do you make sure that all these PV stations are also secured, each and one, and etc. So I think this is maybe from a technology point of view, definitely a risk that we have to take very, very seriously. Then, I mean, if you go a little bit further away technology-wise, I think there's also a risk. Will we have the technologies that allow us for the variability that we need? Meaning, will we have enough storage capacity in the future? And I mean, in a large system like India, or in our case Europe, because it's not just Switzerland, you have to look at it from a systemic point of view. So it's not one country or one area, geographic area. You really have to see the full system. But then, of course, like for example, questions like, do we need hydrogen in larger amounts, and do we need a hydrogen grid, for example? And I'm bringing this up because building an infrastructure like a new grid takes decades, right? So if we foresee now that in 20, 30 years we need it, we will soon need to start investing there. I'm not saying that this is going to be the case. I don't know at all. I mean, there's other discussions about, for example, CO2 grids, that if we have negative emissions, that we need the CO2 grids, etc. So there are many of these questions as well that are more on the infrastructure side, and making now the good decisions for 10, 20, 30 years, it's not an easy task.
That was a really comprehensive answer from you, Dr. Schaffner. And I'm going to ask you another difficult question. Now coming to the policy side of things, Indian policy or public policy is actively driving the uptake of electric cars, storage, and optimization solutions. So how do you see the Swiss energy players like researchers, charging station manufacturers, and storage solution offerings playing a role in India? And what are your expectations from the Indian side, right? Like as an expert in the energy domain. So this can be at the policy level, ease of doing business. I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, again, that's, as you said, it's a difficult question because it's looking into the future, and I cannot predict the future. So what I'm saying now are really like my personal thoughts and ideas. Just wanted to make that clear. I mean, looking at the challenges, as I said before, they're on one side very similar, right? It's not completely different. On the other side, of course, Switzerland and India are very different countries in many parts as well. The simplest one just being the size, right? That, of course, like India as a country is much bigger than Switzerland. But I think what would be interesting is also to use these differences really as an opportunity. And to give you a very concrete example, I mean, in Switzerland, we have really the advantage that we're small, right? That if we do a policy, I mean, we kind of can test it within Switzerland to see if that works, or if you have a new technology coming in. And infrastructure is typically at a good state, so we can really try out new things. And this is something we also trying to do at ETH Zurich. For example, we have a real-time control and data platform, we call it Remap, where we really want to provide kind of a playground to test out these new technologies, to test out flexibility, charging stations, sector coupling, and allow industry partners to come in and test it in a safe environment, but still more than just lab scale. So really kind of in between lab scale and then real pilot and demonstration installations. And hoping that we can, for example, bring new algorithms into the market and test this out. And I think like this, India could maybe take Switzerland as a kind of a test case, right? To see, okay, what is actually working and how can it be implemented, and take that from there. On the other hand, I think what we could do, and where we could really need the help from India as well, is really then in terms of size. I mean, at the end, all these solutions, I mean, if we do something nice in Switzerland, it's good for us, but it will not solve the world's problems because we are just too small. Whereas, of course, if something is implemented in India to a large extent, it has actually a big impact, right? Just in terms of size. And I think this is something that it would be really interesting to also work together there and see, okay, what would also work in a larger scale. And I think the issue we mentioned, we're talking about it before, is really also an issue of numbers, right? That you don't have a few big units, but you have these millions of units. And how do you make a setup that really does work when you have millions of charging stations that somehow need to talk to each other? How is this going to work? I think this is not clear at all. So these were just two examples where I think we could really learn from each other and help each other. And there are many more, of course, but yeah.
Thanks for that, Dr. Schaffner. And I'll just build on what you've already said. um, is that you have been working quite actively in the past with Indian energy ecosystem players. So can you shed some light on your experience and how institutions like, say, this like Swissnex India or any other Swiss institution which is present in India can be an enabler in bringing India and Switzerland closer in a more cooperative sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Of course. I think, and it really links to what was said before, is that I think you could probably help as Swissnex India. You could help cross or create the bridges between Switzerland and India in the areas where we are very different, right? And as I said, like I think challenges are very similar quite often, but then of course the setting is very different, and understanding different policy frameworks. What is working in Switzerland, what is not working in Switzerland, and India, vice versa, right? So to better understand, okay, what needs to be adapted if we have a great solution that works in one country, how could it also work in the other country, and how to bring people together? Because from what I learned with the exchange I had with Indian industry, academia, is of course like the general push and the general idea where we want to go, that's very similar. But then of course how to reach that, it can be very different. And I think this is exactly where an institution like Swissnex India can help to really translate and understand these differences and make them visible and make them also apparent.
Okay, Dr. Schaffner, thanks for that answer. And now I'm going to ask you a question which relates to government. With your work experience, you have been engaging with the Swiss government actively and driving major policy level changes and interventions. So can you tell us about the good practices or success stories that you've had while you were at this role, and something which can be replicated in the Indian context? Of course, India is a very diverse, different country, but some of the good practices, I'm sure we can test and try it out, right? So if you have any good practices to share, that would be really insightful.
Again, not a simple question. And I mean, one thing that I think that can be said in general is that not only looking at Switzerland, but at policies in general, is that sometimes subsidies are, well, maybe people are talking about subsidies quite negatively, right? Because there is, of course, they change the market, they influence the market, and then there are well-known problems with subsidies. On the other hand, what we can see, of course, is that in some areas they really do help to push technology forward. And I think in terms of PV, that was one example how subsidies at the beginning really helped this technology to then strive. However, what is very important there, and I think there Switzerland actually did it quite nicely, is that you need to make sure that you can also, once the technology is there and can really work by itself, that you can exit the subsidy system. And the best is, of course, not to do it abruptly. So like from one year to the next, as has been done in other countries and where you really created problems for industry, but make it very clear and very dependable and very foreseeable as well, that you as an industry partner or as an investor or as any decision maker, you can say, okay, we know that we have this subsidy for the next 5 years, for example, but we know it will be phased out at one time. And try to make this also very consistent and not change this. Of course, knowing that it's very easy to say something like this, but to implement is much more difficult. So I think having a clever policy that includes maybe subsidies if needed, if you think, okay, there we really need to push something forward, but then also already at the beginning, make it very clear on when it will be transitioned into the market. Because at the end, I mean, things that do work nicely, that's where then really investors can come in and see a leverage and see a possibility to also have positive business cases. And yeah, so to give you one small example, I think in Switzerland we have this policy that allows for self-consumption, as we call it, that you can actually optimize your house, your building, or also your for example, business block, a unit where you have your industry, that you can optimize your system to reduce the exchange with the grid, and thus also reduce the grid tariffs that you have to pay. So it's not really a subsidy, it's an incentive to optimize your own system, which also does make sense if you think about flexibility, if you think about future systems where we have lots of millions of independent active players in the field, that you have like these little cells that you can optimize. And there is as I said, an incentive to do that. And it goes in that direction that you suddenly have an incentive to build in a local battery, even though there is no direct subsidy for the battery. But just because in your case, it makes sense to have a battery, or to combine a PV with a heat pump or something like this. And I think this is interesting. These are interesting policy measures that really help push the technology forward without saying in detail what exactly will you need. I'm not saying this is the only solution. There are also some downsides to it. The grid operators sometimes don't like it too much because they will have reduced their grid tariffs. But I think these are things that we can look into and implement if it makes sense.
So basically, I mean, proactive policy making with foresight is what we need in India. Yes, I think
yes,
because of the complexities at play, I think that's what becomes really essential in tying in all the relevant energy ecosystem stakeholders. So I have no other questions from my end, Dr. Schaffner. This was a really enlightening conversation. I got to learn so much from you just having this chat. Hopefully we can work in the near future and collaborate in bringing India and Switzerland together. So I really appreciate this time and effort from your end. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this interview. It was really nice talking to you. And yes, indeed, I do hope we have many more opportunities to collaborate.
Take care. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.